There is a strange rule hiding inside human history, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The people who eventually change the world are, almost without exception, first laughed at by it, not admired, not encouraged, laughed at, dismissed, sometimes locked away, and the more history proves them right, the more convenient it becomes to forget how certain everyone once was that they were fools. If you've ever felt quietly out of step with the room, too strange for the group, too slow to agree, too stubborn to nod along with something that didn't sit right, stay with me. Because what you're about to hear will not just explain why the world's great minds were mocked. It will explain something about you, and about a very specific kind of intelligence the crowd has never known what to do with. We tend to imagine genius as something the world instantly recognizes and rewards. A brilliant idea arrives, and surely everyone rushes to celebrate it. That story is comforting. It is also, almost entirely, a myth. The real pattern is far stranger and far more uncomfortable because it suggests something most people don't want to hear. The very qualities that make a mind capable of genuine breakthrough are often the exact same qualities that make the crowd around it feel threatened, confused, and quietly hostile. By the end of this, you will understand why some of history's most important minds were called insane by their own colleagues. You will understand the psychological mechanism that makes a group of ordinary, intelligent people feel compelled to ridicule the one person seeing something they can't yet see. And you will understand why appearing stupid to the masses has, again and again, been one of the most reliable early signs that a mind is actually years ahead of them. Let's begin with a doctor nobody remembers celebrating in his own lifetime. In the middle of the 19th century, a physician working in a Vienna hospital noticed something disturbing. Women giving birth in the ward, staffed by doctors, were dying of a mysterious fever at a rate several times higher than women giving birth in the ward, staffed by midwives. He studied the difference obsessively, and eventually he found it. The doctors were performing autopsies in the morning, then delivering babies in the afternoon, without washing their hands in between. His conclusion was simple, and to us today, it sounds almost embarrassingly obvious. Doctors were carrying invisible particles of disease from the dead to the living, and washing their hands could stop it. He implemented a strict hand-washing protocol in his ward. The death rate collapsed almost overnight, dropping to a fraction of what it had been. Here's what almost nobody expects to happen next. He was not praised, he was ridiculed. His colleagues found the idea insulting. The suggestion that a gentleman physician's hands could be dirty, could be the very instrument of death, offended their sense of professional dignity far more than it alarmed them about their patients' lives. He was mocked in medical circles across Europe. He was eventually pushed out of his position, and his mental health deteriorated under the strain of being right and completely unable to convince anyone who mattered. He died in an asylum, beaten by guards, just years before the germ theory he had essentially discovered on his own became the accepted foundation of modern medicine. Sit with that for a moment, because it is not a footnote. It is the pattern. A treatment that could have been standard practice decades earlier, saving countless mothers, was delayed by nothing more than wounded professional pride. Here's what almost nobody notices about stories like this. The doctors who dismissed him were not stupid men. Many of them were highly trained, well-read, respected in their field. Their failure wasn't a failure of intelligence. It was something else. Something psychological, something almost every mind is vulnerable to, regardless of how many degrees hang on the wall. There is a concept from depth psychology that explains this almost perfectly. Carl Jung spent much of his career studying how the mind processes ideas that threaten its existing structure, and he observed that the psyche does not evaluate a new idea purely on its evidence. It evaluates it, first and instinctively, on how much disruption that idea threatens to cause to the world the person already believes in. A new idea that fits neatly into existing assumptions gets absorbed easily. A new idea that requires dismantling an entire identity, an entire professional self-image, gets attacked before it even gets examined. This is why the doctors didn't say, "Show me more data." They said, essentially, "This is insulting, and therefore it must be wrong." The emotional reaction arrived first, dressed up afterward in the language of scientific skepticism. But this creates another problem, and it's the problem this entire story is really about. If new, correct ideas are threatening simply because they're new, then the person delivering them is never really being judged on the idea itself. They're being judged on how much psychological disruption their existence causes to everyone comfortable inside the old idea, and the truth of what they're saying becomes almost irrelevant to how they're treated. This is where genius and stupidity start to look, from the outside, almost identical. Jung described a particular kind of mind that appears again and again throughout history's most transformative figures. A mind oriented primarily toward what he called intuition, a capacity to perceive patterns, possibilities, and connections that exist beneath the surface of visible facts, often long before there is enough concrete evidence to prove them conventionally. This kind of mind doesn't reason the way most people expect reasoning to look. It doesn't march step by careful step from evidence to conclusion in a way that's easy for an audience to follow along with. It leaps. It sees the shape of the answer before it can fully explain how it got there. And to a room full of people trained to trust only visible, linear proof, that leap looks less like insight and more like recklessness, or worse, delusion. Here's an unexpected fact about how this plays out in practice. Colleagues of highly intuitive thinkers often describe the same confusing experience. The person seems to arrive at correct conclusions with what looks like insufficient justification, as though they've skipped several necessary steps. And because most people can only evaluate reasoning by checking whether the visible steps make sense, an intuitive leap that turns out to be correct still gets treated, in the moment, as unreliable, even reckless. The crowd doesn't reward being right. It rewards being legible. There is an old archetype that appears, in one costume or another, in nearly every culture's mythology: the fool, the outsider, the wandering stranger who sees the truth that the king's most trusted advisors cannot. Jung's noticed that this figure recurs so consistently across unrelated cultures, precisely because it reflects something psychologically true about how insight actually enters a community. It rarely arrives through the most respected, most established voice in the room, because that voice has the most invested in the existing order, remaining exactly as it is. It tends to arrive instead through the outsider, the one with nothing to protect, the one strange enough to be standing at an angle nobody else occupies. The myth exists because the pattern kept repeating in real life, long before anyone wrote it down as a story. This also explains something that puzzles people about many historically significant thinkers: how often they seem to have operated slightly apart from their social world, comfortable with long stretches of solitude that others would have found unbearable. Solitude isn't incidental to this kind of mind. It's structural. A person constantly absorbed in the reassurance of group agreement rarely has the psychological space required to notice what the group has collectively overlooked. Distance from the crowd, uncomfortable as it is often the very condition that makes the insight possible in the first place. Think about how uncomfortable this makes the position of the genuinely ahead-of-their-time thinker. They cannot fully explain themselves in language the room will accept, because the room's language was built entirely around the old idea they're trying to move past. They are, in a very real sense, speaking a dialect the crowd hasn't learned yet, using concepts that don't have names in the shared vocabulary of the moment. Of course they sound strange. They are describing a world the audience cannot yet see. What happens next surprises almost everyone. It isn't only unfamiliarity that turns the crowd against them. It's something closer to fear, And this is where the story becomes genuinely uncomfortable to sit with. There's an idea in psychology sometimes called terror management, built around a simple but unsettling observation. Human beings construct entire cultures, entire belief systems, largely as a defense against the unbearable awareness of their own mortality and insignificance. A shared worldview, a set of agreed-upon facts, values, and explanations for how the world works, gives people a sense of stability, meaning, and psychological safety. When someone credibly challenges that worldview, even on something as narrow as hand-washing in a hospital ward, they are not simply presenting new information. They are, on an unconscious level, threatening the entire psychological scaffolding the group depends on to feel safe. This is why the reaction to genuinely disruptive ideas is so often disproportionate to the idea itself. Nobody rages at a stranger for suggesting a minor scheduling change, but suggests that an entire respected profession has been unknowingly killing patients for decades, and you are no longer just offering information. You are threatening an entire identity, an entire sense of order, and the mind will defend that order with far more ferocity than it would ever defend a simple factual disagreement. Let's talk about another mind who understood exactly what this cost feels like, though in a very different arena. In the early 20th century, a scientist proposed that the continents we now think of as fixed, permanent landmasses had once been joined together in a single supercontinent and had drifted apart over millions of years. He had genuinely compelling evidence, matching fossil patterns on opposite sides of oceans, mountain ranges that lined up perfectly if you imagined the continents pushed back together, rock formations that told an unmistakable story of shared origin. He was mocked relentlessly by the geological establishment of his time. The prevailing minds of the field found the idea almost laughably unscientific, largely because he could not yet explain the mechanism, the actual physical force that could possibly move something as massive as a continent. Without a mechanism, his evidence, however compelling, was dismissed as coincidence, speculation, the overactive imagination of an outsider who wasn't even trained as a geologist. He died decades before plate tectonics was confirmed as the missing mechanism, and before his ridiculed idea became one of the foundational truths of modern Earth science. The mockery wasn't limited to science. Consider a painter working in the south of France in the final years of the 19th century, producing canvases so unlike anything the art establishment of his time considered acceptable, that critics described his work as the product of a diseased mind rather than a serious artistic vision. His brushstrokes were too violent, his colors too unnatural, his compositions too emotionally raw for a culture trained to value careful realism and polished restraint. He sold, by most accounts, only a single painting in his entire lifetime. He died believing himself a failure, convinced that whatever he was seeing when he looked at a starry night or a field of wheat was simply invisible to everyone else, a private hallucination rather than a genuine perception worth anything. Within a few decades of his death, the very qualities that had gotten him dismissed as unstable, the intensity, the emotional saturation, the refusal to paint the world as flatly as everyone else insisted on seeing it, were being taught in art schools as revolutionary genius. Nothing about the paintings changed, only the crowd's capacity to receive them did. Here's what these stories share, and it's worth naming directly, because it's the hinge this entire video turns on. In both cases, the evidence existed. In both cases, the pattern was genuinely visible to a mind capable of seeing it. And in both cases, the missing ingredient wasn't proof. It was permission, the crowd's willingness to tolerate the discomfort of being wrong, long enough to actually look. This is where things become interesting, because it raises an uncomfortable question about yourself, about the moments in your own life when you've dismissed an idea a little too quickly, not because you examined it and found it lacking, but because something about it made you uncomfortable in a way you didn't want to sit with. Nobody is exempt from this. It isn't a flaw unique to closed-minded people in history books. It's a structural feature of how every human mind, including yours, protects the world it has already built. But that's only half the story, because there's a second, quieter tragedy hiding underneath the first one, and it belongs not to the crowd, but to the genius themselves. Being consistently right before your time does not feel like triumph while it's happening. It feels like isolation. Jung wrote extensively about the psychological cost of individuation, the process of becoming a fully realized, independent thinker, separate from the collective consensus around you. And he was careful to note that this process is rarely comfortable and almost never celebrated in real time. A mind capable of seeing further than the crowd around it pays a very specific price for that vision. The constant, grinding experience of being misunderstood by the very people whose approval would once have felt so natural. This is the part almost nobody talks about when they tell these stories after the fact. Safely, from the comfortable distance of hindsight, we remember the hand-washing doctor as a tragic hero now. We do not fully sit with what it must have felt like to be him, to know, with complete certainty, that you were saving lives, while watching your own colleagues treat you as an embarrassment, a cautionary tale, a man who had simply lost his grip on professional reason. That isn't a story about vindication. For most of his life, it was a story about unbearable, isolating loneliness. There's a particular kind of grief that belongs only to people who are right too early, and it rarely gets named because it doesn't look like grief from the outside. It looks like stubbornness, or bitterness, or an inability to simply let something go. But underneath it is something much simpler and much sadder, the exhausting experience of holding a truth you cannot make anyone else see, night after night, year after year, while the people whose respect you once wanted continue treating you as the problem rather than the solution. This is the price almost never mentioned in the version of these stories, told after the world finally catches up. Vindication, when it eventually arrives for history. It rarely arrives in time to comfort the person who paid for it. The next mistake is even worse, though, and it's one many people who feel misunderstood make without realizing it. Being ahead of your time does not automatically make you right. This is crucial. And it's the part the mythology around misunderstood genius conveniently leaves out. Plenty of people throughout history were dismissed by the crowd and turned out to simply be wrong. Being mocked is not proof of correctness. It is only proof of disruption. The two are not the same thing. And confusing them is exactly how some of history's most dangerous ideas have also disguised themselves as unrecognized genius. This is worth sitting with a little longer than most people are comfortable doing, because it cuts against a very seductive story. The story where being disliked automatically means you're brave, and being disagreed with automatically means everyone else is blind. History is full of people who wore the costume of the misunderstood visionary while actually just being wrong, loudly and with great conviction. The crowd's rejection on its own tells you nothing about which category you belong to. It only tells you that something about what you're saying has disrupted the room. What you do next, whether you keep testing yourself against reality or simply keep insisting louder, is what actually decides the outcome. So how do you tell the difference, sitting inside your own uncertainty, without the luxury of history's hindsight? Here's where the psychological explanation becomes genuinely practical, rather than simply comforting. The minds who were later proven right shared a specific quality that separated them from the merely contrarian. They remained rigorously honest with the evidence, even when it complicated their own theory, even when it would have been easier to ignore an inconvenient detail in favor of a cleaner story. The doctor who discovered the danger of unwashed hands didn't simply believe he was right. He tested it repeatedly, against outcomes he could measure. The scientist who proposed drifting continents didn't dismiss the missing mechanism as unimportant. He acknowledged it as the genuine hole in his theory. and spent years searching for it, rather than pretending it didn't exist. This is the quiet difference between genius mistaken for madness and madness mistaken for genius. One remains accountable to reality, even when reality is inconvenient. The other becomes attached to the feeling of being uniquely enlightened, and starts treating disagreement itself as proof of persecution, rather than as a signal worth honestly examining. This distinction matters more today than it has at almost any point in history, because the internet has made it easier than ever for anyone to declare themselves misunderstood, and harder than ever to tell the difference between someone genuinely ahead of the crowd and someone simply enjoying the identity of being an outsider. A useful, if uncomfortable, question to ask yourself is this: are you still willing to change your mind if the evidence points somewhere you don't want it to go? The truly ahead-of-their-time thinkers throughout history were, almost without exception, obsessive about testing their own ideas against reality, hungry for the exact evidence that could prove them wrong. It was their critics, far more often, who stopped looking once they'd already decided what they believed. Certainty that refuses to be tested is not a mark of genius. It is simply certainty, and certainty alone has never once been evidence of anything. Most people stop here, comforted by the idea that history eventually sorts out who was right and who wasn't, which is exactly why they miss the more urgent lesson hiding underneath this entire story. Because you do not get to live inside history's hindsight. You only ever get to live inside your own present moment, uncertain, surrounded by people confidently certain about things you privately suspect might be incomplete. Here's the strongest insight this story has been building toward, and it deserves to land with its full weight. The crowd's ridicule was never actually a reliable signal of truth or falsehood. It was only ever a signal of disruption, proof that an idea, correct or not, had touched something the group depended on for its sense of stability. Learning to separate those two things, disruption from disproof, might be one of the most psychologically valuable skills a thinking person can develop, because it frees you from two equally dangerous traps at once. It stops you from dismissing an unfamiliar idea simply because it makes you uncomfortable, and it stops you from assuming that discomfort alone makes an idea true. There's a quieter transformation buried inside this understanding, one that changes how you experience your own moments of being misunderstood. If you have ever felt like the strange one in a room, the person whose questions land wrong, whose conclusions arrive faster than anyone can follow, whose instincts keep turning out to be right in ways nobody expected, you are not necessarily a genius, and this story is not permission to assume you are. But you are, at minimum, standing exactly where every genuinely important idea in human history has stood before it was recognized, in the uncomfortable gap between being wrong in the crowd's eyes and being early. That gap is not a comfortable place to live. Nobody pretends otherwise, but it is the only place real insight has ever been born, because insight, by definition, arrives before the crowd is ready for it. If it arrived after, it wouldn't be insight anymore. It would just be consensus agreed upon safely once the risk of being wrong had already disappeared. Notice, too, how differently this changes the way you might treat the next person in your own life who says something that strikes you as strange, or naive, or simply wrong. The instinct to laugh first and examine later is not unique to 19th century physicians or geological societies. It's sitting quietly in every one of us, ready to activate the moment someone disturbs an idea we've grown comfortable inside. The hand-washing doctor needed only one colleague willing to pause before dismissing him. He never got one. That absence cost more lives than history usually bothers to count. The painter needed only a handful of buyers willing to sit with a canvas long enough to let it work on them, rather than glancing and moving on. He never got them either, and he spent his final years believing his entire life's work had simply been a mistake. The hand-washing doctor never lived to see his vindication. The scientist who moved continents never lived to see plate tectonics confirmed. Their stories are not comfortable, and this video will not pretend they are. But their lives point towards something worth carrying with you, something far more useful than the fantasy that genius is always eventually rewarded in a person's own lifetime. What they offer instead is quieter, and in some ways harder to accept. The value of an idea was never actually determined by how the crowd received it. It was determined all along by whether it was true, and truth, unlike approval, does not need the crowd's permission to eventually win. If you have ever quietly suspected you were seeing something the room around you hadn't caught up to yet, this is not an invitation to arrogance, and it is not an invitation to dismiss everyone who disagrees with you as simply too small-minded to understand. It is an invitation to something far more demanding and far more honest. Stay accountable to the evidence, even when it's inconvenient. Stay willing to be wrong, even while trusting your own perception enough to keep looking. And understand, finally, that appearing stupid to the masses was never proof of failure. Throughout history, it has just as often been the earliest, loneliest evidence of being right. Somewhere right now, in a lab, a studio, a small apartment, someone is looking at the same set of facts everyone else has access to, and seeing something none of their peers can yet see. They will likely be dismissed for it. Some of them will turn out to be wrong, and the world will quietly forget them. A few of them will turn out to be right, and the world will spend decades catching up before it finally admits it. From the inside, in this exact moment, there is no way to tell which one they are. That uncertainty is not a flaw in the story. It is the story. The price every genuine act of seeing further has always required of the person doing the seeing. If this changed the way you see the misunderstood minds around you, including your own, stay close, because the next lesson goes even deeper than this one, and it might be the one you've needed to hear the most.